Hi, this episode of the Comics Alternative, one of the most insightful and intelligent comic podcasts out there, is brought to you in part with the support of Patreon pledges from listeners like me, Sal Good Sam. Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that helps content providers generate some income for content they often give away for free, like this show. As a comic artist, I use it myself. It's been a huge help in making ends meet, and I'm super pleased to be able to pass some of that on via my own pledges to a number of other creators like Derek and Andy, so they too can enrich our cultural landscape. Become a patron of the arts and letters. Pledge today at patreon.com/comicsalternative.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 168, our favorite comics of 2015.
Hello, Mr. New Year, hello. Oh yes, we welcome you here. We'll wipe our tears all yesterday, for New Year has come our way. It's true, Mr. New Year, it's true. Our love we see through you.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this is our last episode for 2015, and as Andy and I do every year, we use the last show of the year to discuss what we consider some of the best comics of the past 12 months. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts go higher than that.
That's right, and as we're coming up on the end of December, you can still take advantage of some of the December bundles where you can get a deeper discount on multiple comics from the same publisher than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And as usual, they have a load of bundles from Marvel, DC, as well as Valiant, so check those bundles out.
That's right. It's a great place to get your comics this year and next. Discount Comic Book Service, their website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And we are also sponsored by Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get coffee, tea, and chocolates. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified.
That's right, and you know, we all drink coffee around here, and so Just Coffee Co-op makes it possible for you to drink coffee responsibly. And if you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, that's COOP, you use the coupon code COMICS, you can get 10% off your order along with free shipping. So check out their website, justcoffee.coop.
That's right. It's a great place to get caffeinated. So, Andy, we are doing what I think both of us really enjoy doing, talking about some of what we consider, each of us considers some of the best of the past year. And maybe we should set this up for those who haven't listened to our year-end episode before. What you and I do is each of us picks 10 titles that we consider the best of the past year, and we don't rank them 1 to 10 or 10 to 1, but we do have 10 of the titles that we consider our favorites, but we don't share that information one with the other. So, Andy, I don't know what you've chosen as your 10 best, and you don't know what I've chosen as my 10.
That's right. And you say it's something we've come to enjoy. I do enjoy it, except for the fact that I often find myself in the last 2 weeks of the year scrambling to read stuff that that I had either overlooked or that I had on my to-read list but never actually got around to.
I felt the same way. I think I felt the same way every year, but especially this year. Maybe I should just give some context to my choices. There's a lot that I didn't read that I wish that I had, because I feel that some of the stuff I didn't get to could easily make it into the top 10 or maybe even an honorables mentioned list. And this has happened in the past where, into the new year, I'll finally pick up something that I read or that I didn't read when it first came out, and I thought, damn it, had I read that, that would have definitely been in my top 10 for that previous year, but we can't read everything.
No, that's true, and I think that my list this year is also going to be kind of indicative of the kind of focus of my reading over the past 12 months, which has weighed pretty heavily into certain genres.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I look forward to hearing what your top 10 comics are, and I hope you look forward to what mine are. Before we get into that list, though, I want to describe briefly what 2015 meant to the podcast as a whole, because what I did was I ran some stats, basically counting up things, really simply. Not counting this episode and the final manga episode for the year, we have 139 shows that we have published in 2015.
That's way too many.
We have published a total so far since we started in 2012 of 330 episodes. So that means of that 330, which is everything we've published so far, 42% of the episodes that we've done and put out there for people to listen to were published this year.
And if you think about the average, those episodes average about 5 hours each. So I don't know how many total hours that is.
Yeah. A lot of hours of comics listening goodness. Another thing that defined 2015, I think, in addition to just the sheer volume of episodes we've put out there, we have done 39 interviews in 2015, and that's not counting the episodes that we were on location at, let's say, Heroes Con or Wizard World, where we did brief interviews. I'm talking about interview shows where either both of us or just one of us interviewed someone for the entire episode. So there were 39 of those. We had 8 publisher spotlight episodes, which is also more than we've had in the past. And in addition to all of that, this year we started 2 brand new monthly series, one for manga and another one for young adult and children's comics.
Yeah, so we've become a franchise, basically.
Yeah, in many ways. The Comics Alternative is resembling more of a podcast network than just a single podcast.
Right.
Yeah. But the core of the Comics Alternative has always been our weekly review shows, and there are, I think that about everything, or at least most of the things on my list, let's say, we've either interviewed the creators or they've been a part of our weekly review shows.
Huh. Well, some of mine may have been part of weekly review shows or interviews that I didn't participate in too, since of those 533 episodes we recorded this year, I don't think I was on that many of them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and use this occasion. Number right? No, it's this year 139. it just seems longer, or a much higher number.
Ba 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 ba. New
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into our list. So since you were saying that some of these were titles that we may have talked about on a review show, but we didn't, that you weren't a part of, what is one of your titles?
Well, the last episode I was on, I allude when we talked about the Best American Comics book. I alluded to, you had mentioned that that Bob Skoriak had come up on the show 3 weeks in a row, and I was going to throw out there the fourth week because my first comic I wanted to talk about is the iTunes Terms and Conditions comic that Bob Skoriak put out, and I know I think you and Gene talked about that on an episode, right?
Right, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Really? So that's one of your top 10.
Yeah, and just, it was fun watching that unfold over the course of the time it was produced, and just Skoriak's talent at mimicry, which is evident in a lot of the work he does, like Masterpiece Comics and the sadistic comics that we talked about on a previous episode, and this one, he did, as listeners probably know, he did the iTunes Terms and Conditions agreement. In each page was in a different artist's style, and so there were several that in which the confluence of the text of the terms and conditions and the page he chose to, and the style he chose to use, and often and I think pretty much every time the page was also duplicating a famous page of that particular artist's. That confluence was often really a lot of fun, and I think notable ones were the Little Lulu one, which was I think the second one, and one of my favorites also was the Watchmen page.
Yeah, that was a fun one to discuss. It was, as I said at the time when Gene and I did that review show, one of the most unusual comics we've looked at on the Comics Alternative, and also in many ways one of the most intelligent.
Yeah. It at first it could come across as a kind of one joke, concept or idea, but especially as it kind of unfolded and you got to see the different styles he was using and what felt like really deliberate choices for the different sections, especially ending on Ziggy, which I thought was brilliant. So the whole project was just such an interesting, ambitious, and fun idea that I really enjoyed it. So that's why it made my list.
Well, good. A deserving title. It didn't make mine, but it was one of the more memorable titles we discussed this year. Well, let me share one, I guess the first of my 10 best. And again, this is not in any order, so this is not like number 10 or number 1. But this is another one that we discussed earlier this year, and this is Seth's Palookaville number 22. So I'm, as I, said a number of times on the show before, I'm a big fan of Seth's work and what he's been doing with Palookaville. The one thing about Palookaville that I regret is that we have to wait so long for another installment to come out. But, that's what happens, and he does such good work. And in the issue, I guess we can call it issue or volume, because it used to be an individual comic book or a pamphlet type, but now it comes out in book form where he makes, I guess for the past 3 years, putting more into Palookaville. So in volume number 22, we have a continuation of Clyde Fans, which I guess should be wrapping up in another couple of issues of Palookaville, from what I understand. And then there's the second installment of his autobiographic comic, Nothing Lasts, which I really like. I have recently done an interview with Seth that will be going up on the blog within another week or so, and he goes into detail about Nothing Lasts and how it started as a sketchbook work of his. But I really am enjoying Nothing Lasts. But then the third part of Palookaville number 22 is a combination prose, photographic, comic piece called Crown Barber, which I really like. And this is a barber shop that his wife, who is a barber, bought. And he has created a mock history surrounding this barber shop, even illustrating the official mascot of this barbershop, and you get a sense of reading this section in Palookaville number 22 that Crown Barber has been around for a very long time. I mean, it definitely has that 1940s, 1950s feel that we see in a lot of Seth's work. But part of the joke is that this is a fiction that he's creating. It's an actual place. And if you're ever in that area, you can, I guess, get a haircut there. And maybe I can someday. But I really appreciated that, as well as everything from Palookaville 22, Clyde Fans, and Nothing Lasts. So again, Seth is one of my favorites. I love when something comes out from him, whether it be Palookaville or one of his other standalone works. And Palookaville 22, one of my top 10 of 2015.
So how many pages are in a volume of Palookaville now? Because I haven't been following it since it shifted over to this new format.
Okay, I have my number 22 open right now, and I'm trying to look at page numbers, but there aren't.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's 3 stories, right?
They're stories in the loose sense, and this has been the case for each of the book-sized Palookavilles that have come out. So that's 20, 21, and 22. And the, I guess, most notable addition, usually it's the middle piece, and these are more prose and photography-based pieces that he will introduce, just other aspects of his work. I think in Palookaville 20, there was a part, again, photographs and prose, on the model of the town that he has created. So there's that. In this issue, we have Crown Barber. But yeah, these volumes or installments of Palookaville are significantly thicker now that he's gone from comic book format to book format.
Well, yeah, so that's one I had forgotten even that had come out this year.
So what about you? What's another one of your top 10?
So my next one is definitely a title we haven't really talked about on the show, except in some of the, I think in the Thanksgiving episode, we may have mentioned this with Gene and Andy, and that is Ryan North and Erica Henderson's Unbeatable Squirrel Girl.
Oh, okay.
Which is, I know we don't do superheroes, but this was one of my favorite titles. It's just kind of pure fun and enjoyable, and what really put it over the top for me was a panel. I had posted this panel on Facebook, but I know you don't pay attention to Facebook at all. So, in this current storyline, Squirrel Girl has traveled back to the 1960s, and she's facing off against a time-traveling Dr. Doom as well. And Squirrel Girl bursts into the room and says to Dr. Doom, looks like this doctor is due for his tenure review, and I got some bad news. It's not going to go well for him, yo. So the idea, again, the Dr. Doom tenure review, those are things that, as an academic, I enjoy that.
You got a kick out
that joke, but it is just a purely fun book. And also, one of the things that went into my thinking about some of the books I put on this list is kind of how they fit into trends and movements that I had seen over the course of 2015. And one of the things I've been really happy with, one of the trends, has been with, especially with Marvel Comics, their attempts to create a more diverse universe, a more diverse set of comics that they put out, and more diverse creators behind the scenes. And so I think the success of Squirrel Girl critically, as well as in terms of sales, has inspired Marvel to put out other books that may not have been considered marketable a few years ago. And the ones I'm thinking of specifically are ones that recently started. Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur is in its second issue, and Patsy Walker Hellcat by Kate Leth and Brittany Williams had its first issue come out a week or so ago. And those are really delightful books that I think are in the same kind of vein as Squirrel Girl. They're humorous, they're more kind of character driven, and they don't seem to be incredibly tied into a bunch of Marvel continuity, so they can be picked up by new readers and read pretty much on their own.
A couple things in light of what you've just said. Now, you mentioned that, as part of our mission statement on the Comics Alternative, we don't look at superhero comics, and definitely the big two superhero universes. But in the past, both of us have chosen superhero titles as one or more of our best of a particular year. So, and nothing wrong with that. I mean, just because we don't look at them primarily on our review show doesn't mean that we don't consider it some of the best of whatever year that we're in. So it doesn't surprise me that that's part of your top 10 list.
Yeah. And, I think in general, too, Marvel had a good year. In addition to their works like Squirrel Girl, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, and Patsy Walker Hellcat, I really did enjoy the Secret Wars crossover, though that hasn't quite ended yet, so I don't know if that'll stick the landing or not. But I think that Jonathan Hickman did a great job, and Esad Ribic has done a great job with that series, and there have been several other surprises coming out of Marvel this year. And for the first time in a long time, I'm now buying more Marvel comics than I've ever bought before.
Yeah, I can tell you right now that there is not a Marvel title anywhere on my list. Not my top 10 and not my honorable mention. And in terms of DC, on my top 10, there's only one title, but and I'll get to that eventually, but it's not part of their superhero universe. And I think one of the things that marks 2015 for me, more than the previous several years, is the fact that both DC and Marvel, with their mainstream work, has been doing a lot of what I, in a loose sense, I call shenanigans, right? Yeah. So, having events, rebooting, restarting, multiple number ones of a particular title within a year, that in the abstract, there are things that kind of piss me off. Although, when I actually do get around to reading some of this stuff, many times I like it, and so, momentarily I can excuse all those shenanigans. But there just seemed to be a lot of that going on this year.
Well, yeah, and Squirrel Girl is a title that has had 2 number 1 issues in 2015, but they do have fun with that, too. On the second number 1 issue that came out about 3 months ago, it says, only our second number 1 so far this year. I like that. So they're poking fun at that strategy.
Right. Yeah, and also by poking fun at themselves, it's almost as if they it's like they're get out of jail free. Right? You can't criticize them because they're poking fun at themselves. Though that in itself could be considered a shenanigan.
Yeah, sure. And I know you don't like that stuff. I tend to try not
in the abstract.
Yeah, in the abstract. I tend to try not to let that interfere with my enjoyment of the books. But I can imagine if, for example, if I were a retailer, it would drive me nuts.
Oh, exactly.
As to how do I put the back issues in and arrange them. And I've had friends too say that they bought, it may have even been with the Squirrel Girl series, they bought a new number 1, but then thinking they were getting the number 2 that followed it, they instead got the earlier number 2. And so I can see that happening. Probably happens a lot, especially when there's less than a year between those. But that's not a decision that the creators are really involved in. So I can't hold it against them. But yeah, Squirrel Girl's been a blast.
Yeah, well, since Gene mentioned this back in the Thanksgiving show, I have had that on my to-read list. So now you have given me even more incentive to pick that title up.
Yeah.
Well, another title of mine that I consider the best of this past year is something that you and I discussed earlier in the year when we did our Retrofit Big Planet show, and this is Matt Madden's Drawn Onward.
Okay, that's on my list too, so let's cover that.
Yeah, and in fact, I just assumed that there would be a number of common titles that you and I would choose, and so I guess this is the first instance of that coming up. I really enjoyed this book when we read it at the time, and then going back to look at it again, I've come to appreciate it even more.
Yeah, I agree. I put that on my list because of just what even though it is a single issue, it's really an impressive achievement in terms of telling a story that can only be done this way in comic book form. And I'm always interested in seeing comics that play with the medium in that way.
Oh, exactly. And, playing with the medium is nothing new with Matt Madden. He's done quite a bit of this. I just, want to see more from Madden. He does really good work, and it's not often that we get to see some of his comics. I didn't know that this was one that he had been working on or had just recently come out until we got, I guess we could call it our care package from Retrofit Big Planet. You remember earlier this year they sent, when we said we wanted to do a Retrofit Big Planet show, not only did those guys send us recent releases, they sent us releases that they've had from last year. And so this was one of the many comics that we ended up discussing on that show. And this was a standout. I mean, I liked everything that we read for that publisher spotlight on Retrofit Big Planet, but this stood head and shoulders above the rest for me. What he does with time, what he does with structure, what he does with, a kind of a deceptive style of narration. And we should mention to our listeners that after that Retrofit Big Planet episode, we heard from Matt Madden. We corresponded with him briefly via email. I think he contacted us and said, "Hey guys, thank you very much for discussing the book." And then both of us went back and forth with him briefly about, asking a few questions and running a few things by him. And he was very generous in responding to us.
Yeah, that's true. I really appreciated that interaction to get not only that interaction, but to get that kind of reinforcement that the kind of discussions that we have on the podcast contribute something different to the world of comics podcasting than get out there otherwise. That's
right.
But what since you mentioned the load of stuff we got from Retrofit Big Planet, one of the books didn't make my top 10 list, but one of the books that I really, really liked that we didn't get a chance to talk about on the show was Yumi Sakagawa's Ikebana, which is another single issue story that really makes a very interesting commentary I found on art and performance and so on. So, and it's not a lot of text in the book. It's got a lot of silent passages in it, but it does tell a complete single story, and I thought it was quite moving and effective.
Yeah. Well, one of the highlights of 2015 for me, I guess in a broad sense, are the number of publisher spotlights that we've done. But in particular, publishers like Retrofit and Big Planet, these smaller, for most of our listeners, probably more obscure publishers, and then just seeing the kind of things that they do. And I was really surprised at how prolific that Big Planet Retrofit has been, not being around for as long as they have, being as small as they are, but they put out a lot of comics. And these are more or less like Drawn Onward, right? Kind of shorter narratives that more times than not are one-offs, but there are quite a number of them, and even more impressive is how well done they are. So, not only do we have to commend for 2015 works such as Matt Madden's Drawn Onward, but for small publishers like Retrofit, Big Planet, who, seek these creators out and make them available, because I would be hard-pressed to think of another publisher who would put out Matt Madden's work. It would be someone like a Fantagraphics or Drawn in Quarterly. But I don't think that either of them have published anything that Madden has done. He could possibly get his work published through First Second, because I know that he and Jessica Abel did those 2 books on creating comics through them. But I really appreciated that Drawn Onward is published by such a small press like Retrofit Big Planet.
Yeah. Koyama might be another publisher that could handle a book like this or work more kind of experimental work as well.
Right. It could. The difference would be that that is a Canadian publisher, and but he could just as well publish there. And you're right. That's another publisher that we looked at this past year, and I hope to look at more of these small presses. Probably most of which our listeners are not familiar with in the coming year.
Yeah, and the Retrofit Big Planet stuff was so consistently good that I'm curious to see. They do offer a subscription for their whole year's worth of books that they're putting out, and so I'm really curious to see what 2016 holds for them and what kind of opportunities there might be to subscribe to everything they do.
Yep. Okay, so you said that you also had Drawn Onward on your list. What's another of yours for 2015?
Okay, this is going to start getting into some of the trends that are going to be noticeable on my list. But one of the next books I had was another one that we didn't get to talk about, and I don't know if it got talked about on the show at all. And this is, except that we did talk about it a little briefly in a previews episode when we saw it solicited. And this is Maggie Thrash's memoir, Honor Girl.
Oh, okay.
Did you get a chance to read that this year?
I did not. I have it, and I know that at one point you and I were discussing a special episode, maybe even a roundtable, where we would specifically look at relatively recent memoir autobiographical comics, and this was one that I had for that list. I just have not gotten around to reading that yet. So tell me, what did you think?
Yeah, and this is a book I'm surprised I'm not seeing on more lists this year. It came out from Candlewick Press this year in a year that was really, really good for autobiographical comics in general, and I really felt like this book kind of merged the potential of the kind of potential or the influences of say a Raina Tegelmeier with her memoirs like Smile and Sisters, and say Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, because it is a young adult story Maggie Thrash tells of her experience when she was 14 or 15 going to a summer camp in the South, that in which she kind of discovered that she was attracted to one of the female counselors at the camp, and so her kind of emerging sexuality coming out at this time, along with other things, and along with all the kind of social and peer pressure issues that go along with teenagers in a summer camp. But one of the things I really liked about it is that Thrash really captures how, especially as teenagers trying to kind of find their feet in or their identities in the world, can be alternatively great people and total assholes. And so and Maggie is kind of like that in this book. So occasionally she's really mean to some of the other girls in the camp, but she's also very, very nice to others, and go kind of shows some really exceptional qualities and values as she goes through this difficult experience at the camp. And Thrash's art is also kind of deceptively simple, in a way that I found really engaging. And so the book ended up not going in the direction I thought it would, in terms of how the relationship between Maggie and her the counselor, whose name is Aaron, develops, nor how her relationships with the other campers developed either, especially as her secret gets out to some of her friends and some people who are not her friends.
Mm-hmm. Well, I still think that in 2016, and maybe we shouldn't wait too long getting into the year, we should do this special episode looking at recent memoir autobiographical comics, because there's, this past 12 months alone, I mean, there's tons of material. In fact, we'd have our difficulty would be in paring down what we would want to discuss.
Right. And there's others that we have discussed, or you have discussed with other people, or that you had interviews on, that we'll probably get back to as well as this list progresses.
Oh, okay. Well, that leads me to ask, when you prefaced this title, On a Girl, by saying this is one of the trends, now, do you mean a trend for your reading this year, or just a trend in comics that you see for the past 12 months?
Well, both. I've talked before on the podcast about doing research on autobiographical comics this year, and so I think my list is going to end up being somewhat reflective of the fact that I've been really, really focused on that sort of reading. Especially, I find myself, if I'm not reading for the podcast, I'm reading something autobiographical, or I'm taking a break and reading a superhero comic. So there's been a pretty narrow set of kind of reading experiences that I've had this year.
The old year's gone, and I'm all through. I'm turning this old world over to you.
I'm ready to go, brand spanking new, and I'm wishing a happy new year to all of you.
Well, you mentioned your trend of 2015, and my next title of the best of 2015, I guess, is reflective of what I can see as a trend of mine for this year, especially looking at my top 10 list, because I see a number of books like this. The title I want to discuss right now is Alex Robinson's Our Expanding Universe. This came out back in, I think, early December, and a few weeks ago I did an interview with Alex Robinson, and it was fun to do. And, I'm a fan of Robinson's work. What really put him on the map was Box Office Poison, and then after that, Tricked. And Our Expanding Universe, have you had the chance to read this?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. in many ways, it seems to me like, in a very loose way, a follow-up to both of those books, especially Box Office Poison, in that our expanding universe is like a real-life narrative, and he follows an ensemble cast. And I think that those are two characteristics that define not all, but most of Alex Robinson's work. Now, our expanding universe is the protagonist, primarily male. It's a group of three male friends, and they're middle-aged. They're in their 40s, mid-40s, around that time. And then so in this way, it's almost as if it is a follow-up to Box Office Poison, which came out about, 15 or so years previously. Mm-hmm. And with Box Office Poison, though, you're looking at a group of, let's say, people in their 20s. And so it just makes sense that it's like these characters as they've gotten older, but it's a completely different cast of characters. And one of the things I love about Robinson's work is the way that he brings out the subtleties of behavior, the subtleties of communication and interaction between the individuals in his stories. And we definitely see that in our expanding universe. Another thing that defines our expanding universe is it deals not only with relationships among friends, but also couples. In ways that Box Office Poison wasn't. Our expanding universe is much about couples, whether those couples are married or dating, or even in the process of breaking up or having serious problems. And so we find kind of subtle differences in the way that each of the friends is involved in his own relationship. And so there's that. Another thing I really appreciate about Robinson's work is the way that he visually structures his story, especially as it relates to panel layout. I think he's a master when it comes to playing around with possibilities of different kinds of storytelling with the panel layout. And in that way, he reminds me, in some ways at least, of the great master Will Eisner. And I think that his stories are just as thick and cohesive as Eisner's was at the height of his, I guess we could call, graphic novel phase in the 1980s and into the 90s. So I really enjoyed our expanding universe, and it's one, I said earlier that this is something that kind of betrays a trend, at least of my top 10 list. I think it's these kind of novel-esque, more realistic narratives that seem to populate much of my top 10 list.
Huh. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that in general as a possible trend for the year, for 2015 even.
Yeah. See, I don't necessarily think it's a trend for the year, but I think in my reading habits, it seems to be, because once I compiled my list, and I had a difficult time this year. At first, I thought it would be relatively easy because at first, not that many titles immediately came to the fore.
Right.
And so what I did was I went back through my reading list. I went back through the list of books, let's say, that I have noted on Goodreads. I went through our various episodes, and then other things, just thinking through what I've been reading. And I wrote down quite a number of possibilities that was over 2 times the length of what I ended up with. And so then I had to decide, okay, which do I think are the cream of this crop? And of the ones that I've decided to discuss on this year-end show, many of them are these kind of novel-esque realistic narratives, like our expanding universe.
Huh. Well, then to go in a completely opposite direction, then.
Okay.
For my next choice is one, again, we did talk about on the show earlier this year when the first issue came out, but it's a series that progressively I felt like got better and better, and that is Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen's Descender from Image.
Oh, okay.
It's I like Lemire best when he's drawing his own work, but I think Dustin Nguyen is a great artistic partner with with Lemire. He tends to draw especially children in the same way that Lemire does, or in a similar way, and so that works really well for this, which is, you know, the story of basically a robot child named Tim 21, and this futuristic sci-fi quest in which all these different factions in the universe are after Tim because he contains some operating code that is related to some massive robots that destroyed quite a few planets 10 years prior to the story taking place. And Wynn's art is just beautiful. It looks like it's mainly maybe watercolored, or unless that's an effect in a kind of digital effect. But it looks fantastic, and it's a great story. And one of the things I really loved about it was how every issue felt like a major event in the narrative was taking place. It never felt like an issue, at least in the first 6 issues. There have been 8 issues so far, but I've only read the first 6 issues, that it never dragged at any point in it. And each issue had a pretty solid revelation. And as far as Image books are concerned, it does feel like a kind of worthy successor to something like Saga, which I think has a similar structure to Descender in that Brian Vaughan and Fiona Staples kind of constantly raise the ante in that series pretty much every issue.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I have to say that after the second issue, Descender is not one that I went back to pick up on a regular basis, not because I didn't like it, but just for lack of time. Mm-hmm. And I've said this before on the podcast. I think another defining characteristic of 2015 for me personally is that I have been doing less reading when it comes to ongoing series. So, I mean, we've talked about a lot of individual issues, number one issues usually, on the podcast, but many times after that first and then maybe the second issue, I'll let it go. Again, not because I don't like the title, but it's a matter of time because I know I have to read for other matters, whether it be for the podcast or my work outside of the podcast. So there's only so much to read, and I'm sorry to say that I didn't get beyond issue 2 of Descender, but this makes sense to me what you're saying.
Yeah, I would really recommend checking out the first volume then of the collection. The first 6 issues have already been collected, and and again in Image's strategy of putting out an inexpensive first collection, so you can get those first 6 issues for about $10. Probably less if you use our sponsor DCB service in stock trades.
That's right.
But it is and I think it's a science fiction series which Lemire and Wynn do a great job of world building. Within the first few pages, you pretty much know the state of the universe, that there's been this kind of devastating attack by these unknown robots. Every issue you get a new piece of the mystery being added, so it doesn't ever feel like you're not getting answers, even from issue 1 to issue 2, and so it continues to be compelling throughout. So there were a lot of good series from Image this year, but I felt like Descender really rose to the top for me.
Yeah, it's funny now that I think about it. I do have that first collected trade of Descender, and I even took that with me over the holidays when I went up to my mother-in-law's, and I thought, okay, that's one. And there were 2 or 3 of those trade paperbacks from Image, over the past year that I took up with me that I hadn't gotten around to reading yet. And I said, I hope to have the time to read that up there, and I didn't. As I mentioned at the close to the beginning of this episode, if I had more time to read more of the things that I wanted to that came out in 2015, my list may be quite a bit different. And who knows, Descender may be on my top 10 list had I had the chance to read the first 6 issues.
What were some of the other things you brought with that you didn't get to read?
Let me see which other ones. They were. I don't have them in front of me right now, but I know that they, for the most part, were image trades.
Right.
Which leads me to another observation. In looking at my list, I can tell you right now, I have no image title in my top 10. And I haven't gone back to look at our previous year's best of shows, but I think this may be the first time that that's happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we were getting ready, and we're getting ready to prepare for the show, and I took a look at my shelf of unread stuff that I had gotten so far this year, and I had a pretty large stack of image trades that I have not gotten through.
Oh, yes.
So,
I know the feeling.
And so I started to take a dip into that, and so I had been reading Descender, and then got through the Witches trade, for example, and started in on Warren Ellis and Declan Shalvey's Injection, and I have a few others to go through. Quite a few others to go through as well.
Yeah, Injection was another one of those that I took with me.
Yeah. And so, and again, if I had finished that in time, that could have easily been on my list, but I didn't.
Yeah. Well, also on this topic of current serials, my next one that I want to share with you is the only ongoing series in my top 10 list. And in fact, when I originally compiled the tentative list of a little more than 20 titles for 2015, there were several up there that didn't ultimately make my top 10 cut that I will include in the show notes of the honorable mentioned. We won't discuss these in a concerted effort on this episode. We'll present that information in the show notes. But every now and again, this may come up. There are a couple of serial titles that I thought about as for my top 10 but didn't make it were Keller and Neely's The Humans, and then Hardman and Becko's Invisible Republic. And it pained me not to include either of those in my top 10 list. But the one current ongoing series that I did include in my top 10 list is Alan Moore and Jason Burrows' Providence. And I think that's up to issue number 6. And Andy Wolverton and I, back in, I think it was June, discussed issue number 1 of Providence. And I remember talking with you shortly after. You hadn't read that yet. Now, have you read any issues of Providence?
I did read the first issue, and I liked it. So I haven't gone back and gotten the other issues. But that is something I want to do. I had kind of planned on reading it through Comixology, but then after liking the first issue, I thought, well, maybe I should try to get the individual issues, and when I couldn't find them, I decided I'll just wait for the collection then.
Yeah, and I look forward to not only seeing how this 12-issue series wraps up, but also seeing what the entire collection is going to look like, because this was billed, if you remember, as, I think, the Watchmen of Horror. And there was a part of me that was really skeptical when I read that solicit in previews. I thought, yeah, okay, because I don't know, over the past year or so, I just haven't been, or 2 or 3 years really, I haven't been overly impressed with Alan Moore's stuff. I mean, he's still a really good writer. But even the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff, like the Nemo stories, I've enjoyed them, but they're not the best that he's done.
Yeah.
And this team, Moore and Burroughs, they've done other Lovecraftian types of narratives. There's 2004's The Courtyard, and then Neonomicon. And I was not really that impressed with Neonomicon. So I came to Providence as somewhat of a resisting reader. It's almost as if I was asking this title to prove itself to me. And I was impressed. And that wasn't just a one-off impression of mine reading that first issue. With the following issues, 2 through 6, I've enjoyed it, each of them individually. I really like where this story is going. I think that Moore is packing a lot into this storyline. He's juggling a lot of balls, so to speak. And I'm curious to see how a lot of this stuff is going to come together. I also appreciate the fact that in Providence, Moore is doing something very similar to what he did years ago in Watchmen, in that the final pages of each issue are more prose-based for the most part. In other words, it's a supplementary narrative that parallels or that adds to and even complicates in many ways what we had just read in the comic proper. So this is really good. I like where the story is going. I'm excited to see how it ends up in 2016. But Providence, Alan Moore, and Jason Burrows, one of my top 10 of 2015.
Great.
And that's the only series in my list. So I think you have mentioned 5 of your titles, and one of those was also one of mine, Drawn Onward, and I have mentioned 4. So before we get, I think, to our midpoint, let me go ahead and share with you what I consider another one of my top 10. Then we'll be even.
Yeah.
And this is Julian Hanshaw's Tim Ginger.
Okay.
And, I said earlier when I was discussing our expanding universe that a trend that I see in my list are these novel-like realistic narratives. Tim Ginger is another one of those titles. And I think much of the book does have this almost, at times, surreal, definitely a psychological feel to it. But I do put this firmly in the camp of a more realistic story. And I was not familiar with the work of Julian Hanshaw before we did our Top Shelf episode, our Publisher Spotlight, from a couple of months ago. And I think all of the titles that we discussed from Top Shelf I really enjoyed, but I think this was about at the top of that list. It's a relatively short story, but there's a lot packed into it. And as I remember mentioning during our Publisher Spotlight, I really do appreciate the way that Hanshaw tells his story, because many times the focus of a panel will be different from what is being spoken, narrated, or summarized in that particular panel. And it's almost as if the title character, Tim Ginger himself, as he's thinking through or talking about something, it's almost as if his gaze is wandering around to other things around him, both his external gaze at the real world, but also his internal gaze, his memories, his fantasies, his remembrances. And I think it's that at times almost uncomfortable juxtaposition between the text we're reading and what we're focusing on visually, the kind of offness of that makes this such an enjoyable and engaging story for me.
Yeah, it did kind of slip my mind until you just mentioned it now that book came out this year. But I remember now, I agree with everything you just said about it. I remember really enjoying that as well.
Yep.
There's a new little guy who's coming your way. He's the new year. Yes, sirree. He's full of promise. So each doubting Thomas beware. It's going to be a swinging affair.
Okay, so each of us have disclosed 5 of our 10 best of 2015. Let's take a pause and remind our listeners, if you're getting tired of listening to us drone on about our comics, then what you need, my friends, is some caffeine. And you can't find a better place to get coffee than Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get your coffee, tea, and chocolates. If you go to justcoffee.coop and put stuff in your basket, you will find a place to put in a coupon code. Type in comics, that's our coupon code, COMICS. You will get 10% off of your order every time you order by using that code. And on top of that, shipping is free. And both Andy and I can tell you they do make great coffee.
Yeah, it's good coffee, and if you are falling asleep or getting tired of listening to us drone on, it isn't our fault. That's clearly your fault. You're not caffeinated enough. So go to justcoffee.coop and get loaded up on some caffeine, and they have a wide variety of roasts and coffees to choose from that we can attest, as you said, to the quality of them. And as I've said before, it's also a company that does good things, and so we're all drinking coffee anyway, I assume, so you might as well drink it responsibly.
That's right. So, Andy, before we get back to our list of the best of 2015, I want to share with our listeners what they themselves, some of our listeners, have considered the best of 2015. What we did a couple of weeks ago is to put out a call on Facebook, on Twitter, on the podcast itself, and also on our forum to ask our listeners, what do you consider your favorite books of the past 12 months? And quite a number of people responded, and some of these are longtime listeners who correspond with us quite often. One of those is a Patreon supporter of ours and an avid listener, Rainer Koschnick, and on the forum, he gave us some of his favorite titles of the past year. One is from the Dark Horse Archives, Dick Briefer's Frankenstein. And I know how Rainer enjoys horror comics. But another favorite of his is Harlan Ellison, the collected Harlan Ellison's The City on the Edge of Forever, the original teleplay. And that's a great choice. I didn't even think about that one. And then another one of his favorites is Will Eisner's The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years.
Yeah, and we talked about that on the show, and that is a great collection.
Yep, it is. But I also want to mention other people who chimed in with some of their favorites. On Facebook, John Jack mentioned that and he listed a lot of titles. I'm not going to go over all of them. We don't have the time. But among those, The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, The Sculptor, March, Book 2, and Lumberjanes. Another friend of the show, someone who is often at our Plano On Location episodes, Matthew Cuzio, some of his best, the Sandman Overture collection, Descender, and Secret Wars special Howard the Human. And he also mentions Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. Yeah, those
I had mentioned during my talk about Squirrel Girl that the Secret Wars event was good, but there are quite a few of the Secret Wars spin-off books or tie-ins that were great as well, that really, really surprised me, because normally I see those tie-ins as being kind of tossed off money grabs, but the Howard the Human one was good. The Secret Love anthology was really good, which had a great story by Jeremy Whitley in it, and Jason Aaron and Mike Del Mundo's Weird World, Noelle Stevenson and Sanford Green's Runaways. I could keep going. There were tons of them. Yeah. But there were a lot of really, really good miniseries, and they're all getting collected right now. So people who may have missed those or may not have picked them up because they thought, it's just a unrelated tie-in, I don't need it. There was some good stuff in there.
Well, listen up, because some of the other people who chimed in with their favorites, you'll recognize some of these titles. Bridget Rowan on Facebook said that Saga and Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, two of her favorites of this year. And then a friend of both of ours, Craig Fisher, says that one of his favorites is Josh Simmons's Black River, which is one that we discussed on the show earlier this year. But he also says that Simmons's Habit number 2, which came out in early December, is another one of his favorites.
Yeah, you're using friend pretty liberally there. just kidding. I like Craig, but when I saw Craig post that on Facebook, I realized there's a book that I missed, because I didn't talk about. I wasn't on the episode where he talked about it, and and if there are like a handful of books that I really wish I had gotten to this year, that was one of them.
Yeah. Well, after we did that show on Black River, Craig actually got in touch with me and commented on how much he loved Black River and Simmons's work as a whole. Someone that we've had on the podcast this past year, Randy Duncan, also on Facebook, said that some of his favorites of this year included Southern Bastards, Unflattening, another one we discussed. The Autumn Lands, that's another one I wish I had gotten around to reading more issues of. They're Not Like Us, and Paper Girls.
Yep.
Tom Miller on Facebook said that hands down, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl is his favorite. But he also liked some of the other comics that came out, Moon Girl, Devil Dinosaur, and Howard the Duck. Again, some of those that you had mentioned. And I'm going to mispronounce your name, so please forgive me if you're listening to this. Or if you're not, you can still forgive me. Stergios Batzakis.
No, Sturgios Batzakis. Sturge, who just got married. So congratulations, Sturge.
Do you know Sturgio?
Oh yeah, I know him pretty well. I see him every year at Heroes Con, and we've done some panels. He's at the University of Tennessee, and I've seen him at conferences before. I can't remember if he came to the booth this year at Heroes Con. He was there because I hung out with him for a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, again, Sturgios, please forgive me for mispronouncing your name and for, if we met at Heroes Con, not remembering you. But one of his favorites of this year, and this is another really good book, is Russian Olive to Red King. Mm-hmm. And that was a really good one. We discussed that on our Ad House Spotlight. Osvaldo Oyola says on Facebook that Paper Girls and Silver Surfer, some of the best. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of people chimed in on Twitter. Someone who gets in touch with us quite often, Pascal Hammond, says that some of his favorites are Black Magic, Just So Happens, the graphic novel, Invisible Republic, We Stand on Guard, and the new Brian K. Vaughan and Marcos Martin title, Barrier. Mm-hmm. And then one of our Patreon supporters, Derek Burke, says some of his favorites include Descender, Invisible Republic, Paper Girls, Fade Out, and Velvet. And then finally, we got an email from someone we heard from earlier this year, and this is Rock Langlois. He's up in Canada, and he said that he gave us a list of his top 10, and he even numbered them. So I don't know if this is the order or if he's just numbering them indiscriminately. But number one for him this past year is Black Science. That has the number one. And going down that list, number two, The Sculptor, then Saga, then Dharma Punks, then The Two Brothers, City of Clowns, The Bunker, Long Walk to Valhalla, Russian Olive to Red King, and then Killing and Dying.
Okay.
So we want to thank all of you guys for letting us know what you consider your favorites of 2015. And, some of those made our lists as well.
Yeah, lots of votes for Squirrel Girl, which I feel reinforces my own sense of taste. Mm-hmm. And but a lot of votes for Paper Girls too, which I'm curious about because I don't feel like I'm quite there yet with Paper Girls. It's had, I think, 3 issues so far.
Yeah, and I've only read the first 2.
Yeah, I've read all 3, but I feel like I need a little more before I can kind of decide on it. I'm on board with it because Brian K. Vaughan and Cliff Chang are great. And work great together. I just, I feel like I'm not quite there yet. The way I got there fairly quickly, I think, with Descender.
Yeah, the way I feel about Paper Girls at this time of the year when we're compiling our lists is the way I felt a couple of years ago when Sex Criminals came out, and I think when we did our top 10, I don't know, had the 3rd issue of Sex Criminals come out?
Yeah, I can't remember.
If it had, it was no more than the third issue. And at that point, I was enjoying the title, but I didn't think I had enough of a grasp. Well, I had enough of a grasp, but I didn't think I had an experiential or emotional feel to it, a grasp of it, to put it in my list. And I think that's what I feel this year with Paper Girls. I like where it's going, and I'm curious to see how this will pan out because there are a lot of question marks that are being set up in this series.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I won't go through the entire list, but there are a lot of kind of late in the year entries of regular series and miniseries that have come out where the first issue or two issues have been really promising, and so but not enough to really kind of put them on the list as of yet. Though if we were doing a kind of separate list of best single issues, there's a lot from the last 2 months that I would put in there.
Yeah. Okay, well, getting back to our list, and let me start off now because one or two people mentioned this as one of their favorites of the year, of the list I just read. One of my top 10 is the Will Eisner's The Spirit, a Celebration of 75 Years.
Okay.
I know you and I discussed that earlier this year. This is one of two titles in my top 10 that are older comics in one way or another. And in fact, there were a number of contenders for the top 10 that are either bringing into print older comics or repackaging of older comics that I thought definitely could be in someone's top 10 list, definitely mine. But this is one of the two that actually made it. And one of the reasons why I put this collection up here, and this is this aforementioned DC title, the only Big Two title that's in my top 10 this year, is, as we said on the show where we discussed this, I mean, right now this is the only Spirit collection available. And even though it's a little on the pricey side, if someone doesn't want to get any of the Spirit Archives volume, this is basically what they have right now. And it does lack some of the stories, you and I commented on this, that they could have and should have probably included in this celebration of 75-year collection. Nonetheless, it's a solid collection, and I think it's a great book. It's a great introduction to the Spirit if someone wasn't familiar with the Spirit before.
Yeah, I didn't put a lot of, or I don't think I put any collections of previously published material on my list, but you're right, there were a lot of good ones. But I was just putting together a little about a month ago or so my reading list for my comics class that I'm teaching coming up in the spring. And normally I do teach the Best of the Spirit collection that DC had put out, but you're right, it's out of print, and I don't feel like I can justify having my students buy a $40 book like this one to include Spirit stories in the class.
Try $50 book.
Yeah, 50. Okay. There you go. Which is unfortunate. I wish there was a more economical edition of the Spirit to put out. But you're right; it's a solid collection.
Yeah, it is, and so that definitely made my top 10 list. Now there were a couple of others of repackagings, I guess, that I almost include that will be a part of my honorable mention. One was Dean Mullaney's King of the Comics.
Yeah.
Because I think that was an outstanding collection, as was the recently published Walt Kelly's Fairy Tales. That's a beautiful book as well. Another one that I swear almost made into the top 10 list of mine is Dan Clowes's Complete 8-Ball. And the thing that kept it out is that, and I'm a stickler about this, it's not the complete 8-Ball. It only collects issues 1 through 18. So the last several issues are not a part of this. Now, okay, I can understand not including the last 2 issues of 8-Ball because they really are standalone stories. What became Icehaven, and actually was republished later on in book form as Icehaven,
right.
And then Raygun. But the ones
Death Ray.
Death Ray, that's right. I'm sorry, Death Ray. But the ones that came before that concerned the Daniel Boring story.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they didn't include it as part of the complete 8-Ball because these were kind of different sized issues of 8-Ball. And with the complete 8-Ball, they're going for their facsimile editions, in that really nice hardbound 2-volume boxed set. And it's a beautiful collection. Mm-hmm. But technically it's not complete.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, getting back to my choice of Spirit, celebration of 75 years, of course it's not complete, but I do think that this is a wonderful collection. And right now it's all that we have if people want to read The Spirit.
Yeah, that's right. I would throw into that list of great collections from this year the again going back to our top shelf show the volume 1 of omnibus of Eddie Campbell's Bacchus.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that wasn't. I didn't consider that as one of my favorites, even like within the top 20. But I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
you're right.
I'm
That's
happy.
kind of a repackaging.
Yeah, I'm happy that exists.
Yes.
And that so.
And that second volume comes out next year.
Yeah. Okay. So is it my turn?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So getting back into the autobiography, autobiographical works that are going to end up dominating the last half of my list, is one. And again, I don't know. I know you and I didn't talk about this, and I'm not sure if this got talked about on the show at all. But this is Riyad Sattouf's The Arab of the Future.
Okay.
Did you guys talk about that at all?
We did not. I have not read that one.
Yeah. So this has been a very successful memoir in France, and Sattouf had been a cartoonist for Charlie Hebdo, and he's writing his life story of growing up in the Middle East, and the first volume covers his youth in Syria and Libya first, then Syria, and France as well. His father was Syrian, and he was going to graduate school at the Sorbonne and met Riyad's mother, who was French, and so but ended up getting the father ended up getting academic appointments in both Libya and then later Syria, and so you get Riyad as a child kind of experiencing the early part of the Gaddafi regime in Libya and the Assad regime in Syria, but it's also a portrait of his father, who is a real idealist about his about the potential for peace and unity in the Arab world, but as the story progresses, the father is revealed to be not only naive, but really immature and childish as well, putting his family through a bunch of circumstances that he really shouldn't. And so the book is an education about that region during that period of the late 70s and early 80s, but it's also a kind of fascinating family portrait at a time when someone growing up in a family with both Syrian father and French mother was kind of torn between two worlds.
Mm-hmm. Now, was that a title that we noted on a previews episode?
Yeah, yes, it is, and it was put out, I think, by Metropolitan Books.
Okay, because it vaguely sounds familiar now, but I just never got around to reading it.
And it's the first volume, And so there should be more. And what I'd hope to see, I think, as the work progresses, is getting a more kind of nuanced picture of the father and the father's motives, and so on. It's a really fascinating work, but the father's decisions are so often frustrating and potentially damaging to the family that it's going to be interesting to see how his behavior and his motives progress.
Well, if we do get around to doing that episode focusing on autobiography and memoir comics, then maybe we can discuss it.
Yeah.
Well, on the topic of memoir comics, my next one is actually the one instance of an autobiographical comic in my top 10 this year. Now, there are a couple that I almost included, and I won't name those because they may be titles that you're going to bring up in a few minutes. But one that definitely made my list was Bill Griffith's Invisible Ink, My Mother's Love Affair with a Famous Cartoonist. I read this right before I went to Small Press Expo earlier this year, back in September. And I actually had to read it quickly because, in fact, on my way up, on the plane on the way up to SPX, because I had been scheduled to interview Bill Griffith at SPX. And, as I told you before, we had an incredible interview. That interview is, I had a great time. I hope Bill did as well. That interview is up, and if people can find it by going to the website. But I also wanted to read it, not just because I was going to interview Bill Griffith, because, let me just say I'm a sucker for almost anything that Bill Griffith does. A big fan of Zippy the Pinhead, and I think the very first year that we had the podcast on our year-end show, I included his collection Lost and Found as one of my favorite of that year of 2012. Well, Invisible Ink is one of my favorites this year, and I think it stands out for a couple of different reasons among his volume of work. First and foremost, this is definitely not a Zippy Pinhead comic. Although Zippy does make one or two appearances in the narrative, but it doesn't disrupt the flow of his story, the memoir of his relationship with his mother. And for those who aren't familiar with Invisible Ink, the subtitle more or less says it all: My Mother's Love Affair with a Famous Cartoonist. And in Invisible Ink, Griffith reveals his discovery, relatively young, his and his sister's discovery, that his mother, earlier, when they were little kids, had a love affair with, at the time, a popular cartoonist, someone by the name of Lawrence Laurier. And then, in later years, Griffith, trying to understand his mother a little more, and also his father, which he had kind of a tumultuous relationship with, by investigating his mother's relationship with Laurier and what that meant to him, and of course what it meant to his mother. And so this is a book about the discoveries that he makes along the way, not only about the affair, but also his relationship with his various family members. And also his understanding of himself as a cartoonist, and how, in all possibility, after his father died, Laurier could have been his stepfather, another cartoonist. And he even wonders at one point if, having met Laurier as a young kid, not knowing at the time, of course, that his mother was having an affair with him, if maybe that had contributed to his becoming a cartoonist himself. So it's an unusual story. This is also very notable in the larger body of Bill Griffith's work. This is the first long-form narrative he's written. I mean, not only is it the first autobiographical or memoir-type narrative, but it's the first long story. And in fact, that's one of the things I talked with him about in our interview. And this was a challenge for him, and it was a big task. And so I think that book is very notable for that reason, as well as for a number of others. But have you read Invisible Ink yet?
No, I haven't. That's one of the memoirs from this year that I didn't I didn't get around to. And it's interesting that you mention it because I was just thinking about it. I've been reading lately, last couple weeks, been reading Diane Newman's Dee Dee Glitz collection. I think it's called Dee Dee Go-Go.
Right.
And Bill Griffith and Diane Newman are married, and there's some really fun pictures of the two of them dressed up for Halloween in it. But I keep kind of reminding myself, oh yeah, I should check that out as well. I'm a little disappointed though that it wasn't like a more major cartoonist that the mother has an affair with, because it's kind of teased in the title, right? And that it's not like I don't know, Alex Raymond or or something like that, or what's his name who did or Al Cap. That would have been a better one, Al Cap.
Right. Well, and one of the things that Griffith points out in Invisible Ink, and as well as in our interview, that at the time Larrier was popular and he was famous for what he did. And in fact, Griffith mentioned several times, both during the interview and also in the book itself, that if you had lived during that time, you would recognize his art, because it was many places, and not just in, let's say, men's magazines where you had, gag type strips like you might find on cocktail napkins, but also in a variety of other, through a variety of other venues. Now, he's since been forgotten. And I like that fact that this is someone who was famous for his time, but now no one knows who he is, because I think that makes the story that much more poignant. Another thing about Larrier as a cartoonist, he is worlds away from Bill Griffith and what Bill Griffith became as, first an underground cartoonist, then the creator of, the syndicated Zippy the Pinhead. And so the fact that there is this weird, strange, close relationship between Griffith and Larrier is just fascinating. And it also adds to the complications of his own sense of who he is as an artist, Griffith. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I like the fact that it's not any big time name.
It always is something that I marvel at, that Zippy the Pinhead is a syndicated comic strip. and not not a straight up underground comic.
Right. Still, yeah.
Yeah. Well, if we're going to keep on the subject of autobiography, I guess this might be one of the ones that you did that you had on your honorable mention list that you didn't want to mention in case it came up on my list. But
okay.
This is Jennifer Hayden's The Story of My Tits.
Actually, that was one.
And you did a great interview with her, by the way, this year.
Oh, thank you.
Too. That was a fun interview to listen to, and so this is one of many great autobiographical works this year. But I liked how Hayden took the what is not common, but there have been a number of cancer narratives in graphic memoirs and did something different with it.
Right.
And I really appreciate it. Plus, it's a work that has been, anticipated for years, starting with her, for me anyway, starting with the promise of it through the Underwire collection of her webcomics. So I was glad to finally see this emerge in the light of day, and it lived up to the expectations.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that book, and especially my conversation with her.
Mm-hmm. One other memoir, this isn't on my top 10 list, but almost made it into my top 10 list, and I don't know if you talked about this on the show at all. This came out from Fantagraphics this year, was Bright-Eyed at Midnight by Leslie Stein. Did you read that at all?
I have not.
That was really good too. I again almost put that on my list, and
so that's your honorable mention.
That's one of them, but
yeah.
I wanted to put that, kind of lump that in with Hayden's book, even though it's not a cancer narrative by any means, but it's Leslie Stein took on the challenge of doing a page a day autobiographical comic, and she picks the best of what she did in 2014, and her style, her art style is really engaging and fascinating. It's not a very conventional style. She draws, for example, heads as just kind of hair and 3 dots for eyes and a nose. And her arms are kind of stick arms, but it's really beautifully painted art as well, and just a fun, really engaging work. There's not like a kind of narrative line through it. It goes through different short pieces. Some are only a page long, some are multiple pages, but I really liked that book, and I kind of came across it by accident. So that's why I wanted to throw that in as a kind of thing that we didn't get to talk about this year, but that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. Well, again, we'll have to do this special on recent autobiographical and memoir comics, and that can come into play.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, that'll be a really large list.
Yeah, but luckily I've read most of them already.
Yeah, so I'm going to be the one to do all the work.
Yeah, you got to do a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, my next book that I want to share with you is getting back to what I saw as my trend of this year's top 10 list, another one of these novel-like reality-based narratives. And this is something that we didn't talk on the podcast, and I think we just ran out of time and space to discuss this on a review show. This is Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba's Two Brothers.
Yeah, this is on the list of books that I wish I had read that I didn't get to read this year, because this is showing up on a lot of lists.
Oh, it is absolutely fabulous. Now, I really like what Moon and Ba did a few years ago with Day Tripper. And so I guess I was somewhat expecting something like that, but not really. I mean, I wasn't holding them necessarily to Day Tripper. And I mean, I like other things that they've done as well. I didn't know when I ordered this book through Discount Comic Book Service that this was based on another work by someone else, Milton Hatum, a Brazilian writer. And I mention that because it definitely doesn't take away from Moon and Ba's story. Now, I'm not familiar with Hatum's original, so I couldn't tell you, what this is in terms of an adaptation, but it really doesn't matter, because the story that Moon, Ba, via Hatum tell is just absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that strikes me more than anything about this book is the way that it's narrated. And I think it's a very sophisticated type of narrative strategy that's employed here. It's not until you get, I don't know, maybe a quarter, perhaps a third of the way in, that you realize that the narrator, the, I guess, overarching narrator of this story is, I guess, someone that at first appears to be a very minor player in this graphic novel, if we want to call it that, even though I do not like that term. And this is someone who becomes more prominent as the book progresses, but not only in terms of the actual narrative voice revealing what goes on in Two Brothers, but also the way that Moon and Ba, and I'm assuming Hatum, play around with time and chronology in telling the story. It jumps around in time in ways that could, in lesser hands, be very confusing. And there were a number of times in going through Two Brothers, and I have to mention that it took me longer than I thought to get through Two Brothers, just because it's such a dense, such a thick story. But in going through it, there were a few places where I came to a point and I wasn't sure where we were chronologically in the storyline, and I would turn back a couple of pages, And it was more a matter of me not reading as carefully as I should. So it's not as if Moon and Ba do not tell a clear story. They do give certain clues, either text-based or even visual, as to what time that you're in. Is something a flashback or is it flash forward, depending on where you are in the narration. But it's very sophisticated. And I think the story itself, content-wise, is just outstanding. The way that it's told, I think, is even more impressive. So when it comes to both story and discourse, this is one of the top books for me of 2015.
Good. I have to check that out.
Yes, definitely. I strongly recommend you do so.
Mm-hmm.
We're making a New Year's resolution to spread a little sunshine every day. So start now, we're wishing you a happy New Year all the way.
Okay, so what else for you?
We're getting pretty close to the final stretch here. This is a book that we talked about earlier this year, and that is March Book 2 by John Lewis, Andrew Aden, and Nate Powell. Mm-hmm. So we talked pretty much at length about it, and so I don't know how much more to get into that. But it is... I thought Book 2 was even better than Book 1. We're definitely getting into, with this trilogy, the heart of the real kind of violence and suffering that those people who were protesting for civil rights in the 1960s experienced. And and I thought that Powell had done an amazing job with the art in creating the sense of what that experience was like. And so this is continuing to be a great autobiography as well, and I'm looking forward to Volume 3, wrapping it all up. And once it does, I think this will be not only one of the great memoirs, great comic memoirs, but also a really, really teachable book.
Right. You know, this is one that I considered putting on my list, and I have to say that, a couple of years ago when we did this, March Book 1 was in your top 10 for that year, and it wasn't in mine, and then this year Book 2 is in your top 10, and it's not in mine. I feel remiss now, and, of course, both 1 and this year Book 2 are in many best-of year-end lists, but I don't have them in mine, unfortunately, but they definitely deserve to be there.
Yeah.
So you're right, and I agree with you, Book 2 being stronger than Book 1, so that whets the appetite even more for Book 3.
Yes.
Okay, so you're right, we're coming into the home stretch, and I got 2 more. I think each of us have 2 more to share. Remember earlier I said that with The Spirit, the 75-year celebration book, that was one of 2 that pulls together previously published or older works. Well, the other title is The Eternaut by Hector Osterheld and Francisco Solano Lopez. This came out earlier this year from Fantagraphics. And do you have this book? I don't know if you've read it yet, or are you wanting to?
No, I want to, and I'm kind of kicking myself. I did a big purchase during Fantagraphics. Cyber Monday sale where everything was 40% off. I bought a load of stuff through that, and while the aforementioned Leslie Stein's Bright-Eyed at Midnight was one of those books I got, I had The Eternaut in my cart, and then when I had to pare it down because I was going to go broke if I had bought everything that was in my cart, that's one that went.
Yeah, well, you can still find it at a really good discount through Discount Comic Book Service, or I guess In Stock Trades, or even on Amazon. You can still find it at a pretty good discount. But this was one I had ordered through DCB Service, and I got a good discount. I can't remember how much of one. But when I was at SPX, they had the Eternaut. I don't know if it's Eternaut or Eternaut, but they had this there. And, of course, I didn't get it at the time because I already had it on pre-order. But this is one of those titles that actually Andy Wolverton and I will be discussing in January.
Okay.
In fact, I think if everything goes well, we're going to devote an entire episode to the Eternaut because we're going to also bring on to the show a scholar who's done a lot of work on the Eternaut, who is also Argentinian. And so we're going to talk about the Eternaut. But this is just a fabulous comic. For those who don't know, this was originally serialized by Osterheld and Lopez between 1957 and 1959. It's I guess, a science fiction story. It's kind of a strange science fiction story. It deals with it kind of makes sense within the context of the immediate Cold War years. It's an invasion narrative. And so you find out at the outset that Buenos Aires, which is where this takes place, something strange goes on, and the characters learn fairly early on that there's some kind of invasion of some sort by some kind of alien. And little by little, they learn the details of this invasion and what happens. And so in many ways, this is a science fiction narrative that has a lot of turns, many of which are very unexpected as this strip progresses. It definitely does have a strip feel to it that with each installment, and my sense is that each page of this book, and it's about 350-some pages long, that each page was an installment of the serial, because at the end of one page and at the very beginning panel of the next, there is this sense of cliffhanger and then picking up where we left off, and at times even a little reminder for the reader of what had just happened in that previous installment. But it's not disruptive in terms of that kind of serial move by kind of recapping and having a cliffhanger at the end. But it's a fairly fluid story. Not only is this a great science fiction narrative, but it also has political import, because this was written in many ways as kind of an allegory to the politics of the time, the Cold War politics. And then the Eternaut is also important because the visual figure of the Eternaut has been used then and now politically in Argentina and then elsewhere. Another thing that's notable about the Eternaut is with this year's publication by Fantagraphics, it is now for the very first time available in English. And I'd be curious to know, it's been published in many other languages. Why has it taken so long to be translated into English?
That's a good question. It's a beautiful book, too.
Yes, it is, and it's one of those that's awkward to read because it's long horizontal wise, and so you can't comfortably hold it with one hand. And I've tried many times, but I really like the way that it's put together. The one thing about the book itself, because it's in a slipcase and then there's a covering as well, and those are really nice. But when you take the book out of those accoutrements, I guess it's kind of a shiny silver, kind of like a foil, and that kind of shininess kind of gets on my nerves. But other than that, I love the Eternaut, and it's like I said, I don't number these 1 through 10, but it's definitely up there as one of the top 10.
Okay.
So what next for you?
I actually would say that my last two are my top two books of the year, and so getting to number 2 is and again, didn't talk about this on the show, and I don't know if you talked about this also on the show without me, but is Trashed by Derf Back Derf.
No, we did not, and that's another one of those books like Two Brothers that I wish we had taken the opportunity to discuss, and I'm glad that that's on your list.
And so this isn't Derf says that this is not a autobiography, though it is based on his experience doing one of the worst jobs in the world, which is being a garbage man. And you can get a sense from the narrative that kind of frames this book is, this experience of a young man who's referred to as JD, which is would be Durf's initials in real life, and you get these kind of episodic experiences of what are the kind of worst things that a garbage person experiences in their day-to-day job, whether it's getting a heavy bag full of basically liquefied garbage that then breaks and spills all over them, or having to make a run to the local dog pound and the piles and piles of dog crap that they have to take care of, and all these other just really, really disgusting experiences. But around that frame, around that story of that experience, Durf has also done an enormous amount of research on the kind of state of garbage in the United States today. And so we get some information about how landfills are operated and how devastating those things can be to the environment, and how little regulation there are of them, how much of different kinds of garbage is produced every year, how things like planned obsolescence of appliances and stuff like that has contributed to an increased amount of garbage being produced every year. And the reason why this made it to the top of my list is because ever since reading this book has kind of haunted me. Throughout Christmas, as we would get packages from, Amazon or from gifts from other people, and I'd look at the amount of kind of waste that came with that packaging. This is something that comes up in that book. I would think, here I am. I'm contributing to this horrible world that Durf has illuminated in this book. So now every time I go to the garbage, every time I put something in the garbage, I think of this book.
I'm with you. This has to be, because I love Trashed. Uh-huh. It's not in my top 10. This has to be the grossest book of 2015 for the very reasons that you're mentioning. Uh-huh. The various garbage, let's say, experiences that they have, and also those statistics that Durf includes throughout the story. It really does get you thinking. I mean, not only are many of the scenarios that JD and what's his friend's name that he works with throughout most of the book?
Oh, I can't remember.
Yeah, but the two of them, I mean, a lot of gross situations that they find themselves in, but also just the disgusting nature of our disposable culture. And it's not just ours, American 20th, 21st century. I mean, one of the things that the narrator does is points out that throughout history, there have been nations and civilizations that are more garbage heavy than ours. In fact, at one point, if I remember correctly, he points out that I think Canadians per capita produce more garbage pound wise than citizens of the U.S.
Yeah.
So take that, Canucks. But it is a really disturbing book, but disturbing, I guess, in a good way.
Yeah, if it gets the reader to change his or her behavior.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at the book. One of the statistics he points out is that about 1/3 of all the garbage produced is packaging. Mm-hmm. And that's that statistic alone is what has basically ruined my Christmas. But so thanks for that. But no, I mean, I think that it would be one thing to get a book that hit you with all of these statistics and details and all this research that he's done, but on top of that there is this really kind of compelling episodic story that goes on with entertaining characters, real characters in every sense of the word, their kind of quirky and bizarre behaviors, I guess, that make somebody want to be a garbage man in the first place. So it never gets kind of dry and statistical. It's always a compelling story, again, with characters that are endearing and interesting, and clearly based on many of the kind of experiences that he had when he was doing this job.
Exactly. And you mentioned that this is not an autobiography. It is technically a work of fiction. And I did speak with Backderf at SPX. In fact, he was the first creator that I had the pleasure of interviewing when I got there to SPX on that Saturday, that very first day. And, he was adamant in pointing out that, when I talked with him, that, this is not an autobiography.
Right.
This is not a memoir of my past. Although, and you read this in the introduction, the book Trashed had its roots in autobiography because, if I remember correctly, he wrote that he had published via the web in earlier installments on this, and it was intended originally, I think, as something much more autobiographical. Mm-hmm. But then when he decided to write a much fuller story, he decided to take the more fictional route, using as a springboard his own personal experiences. Although to me, those sections of the book where you get the statistics, that seems to pull it back into the autobiographical realm because, I mean, that could be JD's voice, and I guess technically it is. But to me, it seems much more the voice of Backderf than it does JD, although JD is, I guess for all practical purposes, his fictional stand-in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would lump this in with more with kind of reportage, maybe, so that there is definitely the experience that he had as a garbage man that feeds into these these disgusting things that happen to JD and his crew. Clearly those are most, if not all of those, are based on things that really, really did happen to Backderf, but also the research and so on that went into it reminded me a bit too of, say, moments in Joe Sacco's work, for example.
I was about to say, now when you started to mention the reportage, I thought, okay, you're right, because it does have more, it seems to be more akin to Joe Sacco's work than, let's say, something like Two Brothers, one of my choice, or Tim Ginger.
Mm-hmm. Or My Friend Dahmer, for that matter, going to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Yep. Although that was a memoir.
Right, but it's it's less of a memoir than it is something like that, something like a work of comics journalism.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I wonder why he didn't go that route instead of framing it as a graphic novel.
Well, I think it works. Whatever the choice is. Yeah, I think it was a good choice because that the sections with and I think we've been saying JD, but I think it's JB, right?
Oh, is it JB?
I can't remember now.
Okay, I don't have it in front of me. Yeah.
Now I forgot what I was saying. But anyway, that those kind of the really humorous and disgusting stuff that those guys experience really provides a nice balance to the horrible guilt-inducing facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is one of your top two. You're saying that your last two picks you would consider the top two of your 10.
Yes.
Now, I don't want to go as far as to say that my last two I would consider number one and number two, but I will say that my last two picks, one of which is The Eternaut, were two of the very top of that top 10. Mm-hmm. So my last best of pick for 2015 is something that we discussed on the show when we did a publisher's. No, actually, it wasn't upon a publisher spotlight of Continuum. This was in a later episode. This is Ant Sang's The Dharma Punks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I said earlier that a trend that I see in my list this year are these longer novelistic works that are more realistically based, and this definitely falls into that camp. Now, have you read Dharma Punks?
No, but I remember you talking about it. I wasn't on the episode that you talked about it, and it was really you really did praise it quite a bit and made it really made me interested in checking it out.
Yeah, this is a phenomenal book, and one of the things that blew me away was the fact that I didn't know of Ant Sang's, and I don't know if it's Sang or Song. It's S-A-N-G. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I wasn't familiar with his work beforehand, but I'm glad that I was introduced to this. Now, this was published several months ago by Continuum, and another thing that caught my attention was that Dylan Horrocks, another New Zealand creator, wrote the introduction to this. And I think Dylan does a fine job of setting up this story. This book has been in my head ever since I read it. You know, I said earlier that when I was compiling this year's list, not a lot of titles leapt to the fore. And throughout the year, as we've been discussing comics on the show, or as I've been reading, even things that we haven't discussed on the podcast, not that many titles after I read them did I think to myself, this is going to be one of those in my top 10. I remember feeling that with Drawn Onward. And you and I may have even commented on that, this may be in our top 10 list at the end of the year, and it was. I think the only other title that as I was reading it, or right after I read it, and I thought, I'm pretty certain that this is going to be in my top 10 of the year, was Song's Dharma Punks. This is... It's just a great story, not only in terms of the content, but also, as I've mentioned with, let's say, like Two Brothers, the way that the story is told. And Song does a phenomenal job of setting up his narrative and playing around with time and narration in doing this. And this is a story that takes place in the 1990s, and it concerns a group of anarchist punks, I guess you could call them. The most prominent of which, he's the protagonist, is someone who goes by the name of Chopstick. And one of Chopstick's heroes, or at least his points of inspiration, is Kurt Cobain. And so this takes place very soon after Kurt Cobain committed suicide. And so Cobain makes appearances in this narrative, but through the more fantastical parts of this. Now, I said that this is a realistic narrative, and it is. But as with some of the other books I've mentioned, like Tim Ginger, there are parts where we get into the protagonist's head, and in this case it's the character Chopstick, and we see that what he's experiencing right now is very fantastical, but this is part of his world of memory and just psychologically trying to make sense of things. And so there are several times in this story where Kurt Cobain does come to him and talk to him and counsels him and tries to give him some kind of guidance or some kind of direction. And so there are moments like this that are a little more on the fantastical end of the spectrum. But what happens here, this is a story based in the real world. And so you have a group of anarchists who, as the story opens, they're planning on disrupting an opening of a fast food joint, very much like a McDonald's. This starts to take a much more serious and darker turn when we find out that people who are outside of this initial group of anarchist friends are really the ones calling the shots for this, anarchist act, to where it becomes something much more violent. And so in many ways this story is about what happens with the members of this group as they discover that they're being manipulated. And so they have to ask themselves, specifically Chopstick has to ask himself, does he want to be a part of this ultimately very violent act, or not, and how might the participation in this act take away from his own sense of who he is and his understanding of himself as an anarchist in many ways. And then we get to see that his sense of himself as an anarchist is not really carved in stone, that this is something, I think, to temporarily hang his hat on, so to speak, until he can get to a fuller sense of who he is. And so much of the Dharma Punks is a growth narrative of Chopstick as his sense of who he is, and especially within this community of friends, kind of ebbs and flows.
I'll definitely need to check that out.
Yeah, and it's also a hefty tome. This comes in at about 415 pages.
Wow.
So, and again, if this is not my number one best of 2015, it's in the very top part of my top 10 list.
Huh. Well, I think mentioning that it's a hefty book gives a nice segue into my final book.
Okay.
Which is a hefty book, too. And, you know, in setting this up, I was 100% certain that we would end up on the same book at the end of this. And so...
so you're surprised?
I'm surprised, but I think that happened last year, too.
Here, yes. Both of us chose Here as about the top pick.
Yeah. So my top pick is... And I'm surprised this isn't on your list at all, but maybe you can explain yourself.
Okay.
And that is the Drawn and Quarterly 25 Years of Contemporary Cartooning Comics and Graphic Novels book.
Oh, okay.
Which was my favorite book this year.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
You know, I considered putting that on my list, and the reason why I didn't, I guess because it was just something very different. I mean, you know, anthologies aren't that unusual.
Right.
I mean, we talk about anthologies all the time on the podcast, but this is a different kind of anthology, and I think the nature of that collection, as much as I appreciate it, I didn't immediately think of it as something that I would consider the top 10. I mean, when I said, a couple of times earlier on this episode that it was a tough list for me to really cull down once I actually sat down and wrote out what could possibly be in my top 10. I mean, I meant that. I mean, it was really difficult. And there are some titles on this list that have been very painful for me now to include in the top 10. And you just have to make cuts somewhere. And Drawn and Quarterly, that big tome did not make the cut.
Okay. But what I loved about this book is that it is a true kind of history of the company. Giving us a lot of the samples of the many different creators who have contributed to contributor works to Drawn and Quarterly over the years. But what I thought made it stand apart from a normal anthology is the mixture of brand new work and older classic work. You know, so. You get excerpts from some of the great works that Drawn and Quarterly has put out, like Jason Lute's Jar of Fools and so on, and Julie Doucet's work. But you also get brand new work by many creators as well,
like Joe Matt.
Like Joe Matt, and that alone for me was the big selling point for this. The fact that we've got basically everything Joe Matt has produced in the last 10 years in this book, which is a total of I think 18 pages. Or something like that,
which is kind of sad because I really like Joe Matt.
Yeah, and he owns the fact that he is just absolutely not productive.
Well, he doesn't have Seth and Chester to keep his rear to the flame.
Yeah, now that he's living in California, I guess, which is, or at least that's where he is when in the pages that he produced. But it also has Yeah, so let's see, how many pages is that? Actually, it's less than 18. It's about 14 or 15. That one of the pieces that Joe Matt includes in here is Seth's going away speech.
Yeah.
When Joe leaves, what was it, Toronto, right? And he moves to California, which was it was in 2003. So I don't know if in our lifetimes or in Joe Matt's lifetime we're ever going to get another issue of Peep Show. I've kind of settled on.
I hope so.
I've settled on that maybe never happening. But I do like seeing at least those pages in here, two completed stories, and along with just a host of tons and tons of other great work in here. I really like one of the things I really like is early in the book is the Kate Beaton piece, and this is such a huge book it's hard to find anything in here that I want, but Kate Beaton shows up a couple times, and I would mention too that probably if I had read Step Aside Pops, that would have been on my list too, but I didn't read Step Aside Pops this year. How she pitches to Chris Oliveros, the publisher of Drawn and Quarterly. She says, "Chris, baby, I got another Whammo cartoon for you," and it's basically George Washington farting, and somebody comes to her house and gives her a bag of money. So that's great. But anyway, yeah. So it's got works by the great creators that have published with Drawn and Quarterly over the years, either new or reprints, along with appreciations of those creators by different people, either other creators or authors and so on.
Now that you mention that, I think that may be one of the things I was thinking about when I didn't even put it on a list to consider, is that kind of mix-up between the prose, for instance, the appreciation, and the comics themselves. Mm-hmm. It's just something that didn't resonate with me as much as, let's say, every other comic that I've mentioned in this episode. Mm-hmm. And also, it's the excerpt bit. Now, I was talking a little bit last week of my feelings about excerpted from, small excerpts from larger works with the Best American Comics volumes. And, I do feel mixed about excerpts, and not only in comics, but just in general. And I think that is another reason why I didn't even think about including it on that list, because, sometimes that kind of bothers me a little bit. But again, I feel a little mixed about this. I can see why it has to be excerpted, and I can see why you include someone's work even in part. On the other hand, I don't know. I'm just not as I don't appreciate it as much, I guess, as you do, which is one of the reasons why I would never really consider including Best American Comics in our year-end list. For that reason, largely, I think, and also because we talk about it in a previous episode. But yeah, it is a great collection, and it does a lot. But I think for me, it was a beast that was very different from anything else. That's the reason why I didn't even consider it.
That's interesting, because when I think about say like Trashed, I mentioned how Trash keeps kind of coming up in my thoughts ever since I've read that book. It's kind of haunted me. I wouldn't necessarily say that about this collection, but what I found myself doing with this collection since it came out is just pulling it off the shelf and dipping into it in random places.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of those books you can do that.
Yeah, and I really, really appreciate it for that reason. And so I would keep. I think I'm going to keep doing that too as we go along with, or as this stays on my shelf. So one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that it is really well made. it is a thick book. It comes in at about 750 pages, but it is tightly bound, so I feel like I can keep opening it up over and over again without it falling apart. Unlike, say, for example, the previously mentioned Joe Matt, all of his books, for some reason, have fallen apart on me.
Yeah.
At least the paperback ones, and I don't know why his books in particular. It's just that I read them so much, or I open them up and flatten them out on my desk, and then.
Well, I think the medium is the message.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Joe Matt himself is someone who kind of falls apart and breaks up. The character, at least.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my favorite book this year.
Wow. When you mentioned that it's one of those that you take off your shelf and you can pick up almost anywhere, and that's one of the things you love about it, it reminds me of a title that I for a second or two considered putting this on my list, but I didn't because it's technically, it's not a comic. It's a book about comics, and that is John Morris's The League of Regrettable Superheroes. I have to say that was the most fun read of 2015, comics or prose, it doesn't matter. I had a great time reading that, and I had a fun time talking with John on a previous episode when I interviewed him. And that's one of those books that, I did read it from front to back, but before I did that in a concerted way before the interview, every now and again I would take down League of Regrettable Superheroes off the shelf or from the stack of my books, and I would go through and spot read certain chapters, these brief introductions to these superheroes that were kind of strange in one way or another, and I would read these out loud to my family members at times as well, much to their chagrin. So, okay, Dad, enough of that. So, oh, no, you'll get a kick out of this. This is a superhero called the Eye. It's just an eyeball, and that's it. It's just strange stuff. Yeah. But I didn't include it on my list because it's not really a comic.
Yeah, I regret not being involved in that interview, but I just didn't have time when that was going on. But that's a book I literally keep in my nightstand.
Yeah, it's fun.
So that I can, but can't get to sleep. I pick it up and I can just dip into it anywhere, like you said.
Yeah.
It's a long time from Christmas to New Year. When you are not around, it seems as long as from June to December. Sweetheart, when you are not around.
Well, Andy, God, this is impressive. And again, we should point out to our listeners that neither Andy nor I knew what would be on the others' list. And that's one of the things that makes this so much fun. And this year especially, because I'm really not surprised, but I find it interesting, I guess, that we chose the books that we did. More specifically, we only had one overlap.
Yeah. I was
expected
surprised
there
by
to
that
be...
too.
Yeah, and that was Matt Madden's Drawn Onward. I was expecting there to be more. Like, for instance, you expected me to pick, the Drawn and Quarterly collection, and I thought that maybe you would pick Tim Ginger.
Yeah.
I also thought that both of us, or that you might have chosen Carol Tyler's Soldier's Heart.
That was on my list, actually, and it fell off my list eventually, but that one I went back and forth on because it is because I have the new version, but I also have the 3 volumes from before.
Right.
It's almost the same reason why Adrian Tamaya's Killing and Dying didn't make my list. Because I had basically, I'd read everything in it already in previous versions. I'm not in any way consistent with my rules about what makes it and what doesn't make it onto my list. But you're right. That Soldier's Heart book is a great book, and it, one of my favorite comic memoirs of all time. And
right.
It is a massive book too. That is a hard book to read as well.
Right.
Physically.
And that's one that I did take with me to my mother. Actually, I started reading it before I went out of town. But once I finished my final grades, I did pick that one up. Now, I'm one of those who did not read the original 3 installments that eventually made up, along with additional material, I think, Soldier's Heart. But I absolutely love Soldier's Heart. It almost made my list, but not quite. And you mentioned Killing and Dying. Now, Killing and Dying's been appearing on a lot of year-end best-of lists. And, you know, I like Adrian Tomine. I really like Killing and Dying. We discussed it a few weeks back on a review show. Gene and I did. And I didn't include it on the list. I think partly for the same reason that you had mentioned, that, yeah, I'd read those 3 previous issues of Optic Nerve. But also, compared to some of the other things that I really loved, it just didn't stand out as much for me. I mean, I like Killing and Dying, and it's on my honorables mentioned list, but compared to things like Dharma Punk's Invisible Ink, the Spirit Collection, all of the above that we've been discussing, you know, including many of the titles that you had listed, I don't think it measures up for me as much as it does, but it is a very good book.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised that neither of us picked Peter Cooper's Ruins.
That's on my honorable mention list.
Yeah, because you and I really talked that up. And, you know, we're going to have on the website what not only Andy and I have just revealed as our 10 best each of 2015, but also an honorable mention list. So make sure you check out that at comicsalternative.com. And before we go, though, I want to mention, and we've done this occasionally, not every year, but kind of goodbyes, series that we're sorry to have ended over the past year. And for me, 2 titles stand out, and both of them are the Vertigo titles, Unwritten and especially Fables. I'm sorry to see them go.
Yep.
Are there any titles that, let's say, serials that you were sorry to see end?
Yeah, I mean, this one that kind of came in and went in within the same year was Tim Seeley and Marley Zircone's Effigy from Vertigo, since you mentioned Vertigo. And one of the reasons why I feel bad about that is that it kind of left without any, it got canceled without any fanfare.
Yeah, that's sad.
It was just very suddenly not in previews anymore, and it really kind of picked up a head of steam at the end of its first arc, and so I was disappointed to see that one, you know, both begin and end so quickly. But you know, there's a lot of series that, not so much that I'm sad are gone, but that I wonder if they're coming back. You know, Afterlife with Archie, for example, is and the Sabrina comic as well are both being published, it seems, very sporadically. So
right,
I don't know if those are still. I can't say I can't do a post-mortem on those because I don't know.
Yeah, I just expect them to come back. Well, you know, Effigy. Do you think they could bring Effigy back at some point for another arc?
They could, but I doubt that's going to happen unless Tim takes it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. And a DC series that isn't over yet, but its end has been announced, is the Omega Men series that Tom King's doing. And I think Tom King has really come out to me as one of the real surprises of 2015 as a writer. He collaborated again with Tim Seeley on Grayson,
yeah.
But the 2 issues he's produced so far of the Vision comic for Marvel has no business being as good as they are.
And he does what, Sheriff of Baghdad?
And Sheriff of Baghdad, there's only been 1 issue of that, and that was a really impressive first issue.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should mention here as a teaser that next month, Andy, you and I are going to do another Vertigo Publisher Spotlight episode. We did one a little more than 2 years ago, and we've decided to do another one with this latest round of new Vertigo titles. And so that's something to look forward to in January of 2016, along with something else that I teased earlier, a discussion of the Eternaut. So fun stuff to look forward to next year.
Yep.
But if you want to find out the great stuff that we've been discussing that was published this year, you can find great prices at Discount Comic Book Service and their sister company, which is In Stock Trades. So whether you go to dcbservice.com or instocktrades.com, you probably can't find better deals. In fact, I'll say I guarantee you can't find better deals on the vast majority of the titles that we've been discussing on this episode.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And after you do get your comics there, please do get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you've been reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Pinterest, and on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find the podcast on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our episodes, all 330 of them, at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
Yeah, and we do like to hear from you, just as we heard from many of you, as we mentioned earlier, telling us about your favorites of 2015. Yep. Well, Andy, this is the last time that you and I are going to be recording an episode for 2015 before the new year. So I hope you have a nice new year and New Year's Day.
You too, and I hope that maybe we're not going to do this, but it would be interesting to do a follow-up to the year-end show where we actually do read everything we should have read. like do a second year-end show in like March.
Yeah.
I think these are the books of 2015 we really should have read by now.
Yeah. Well, that list for me is so long that would probably be a longer episode than this one.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But a lot of good things that we did read, more great things I'm sure that we didn't get around to. But hey, that's what having time away from the podcast is all about, if we ever had some time away from the podcast.
Yep.
Yeah. So we do appreciate you guys listening to us throughout the year. Please come back for our episodes in 2016 and have a good new year. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.
1, 2.